Welcome to today's program with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Alma Gottlieb, who is an award-winning cultural anthropologist and former president of the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She studied religion, gender issues, children and families, and African lives for decades. Since 2006, she's been researching the West African island nation of Cabo Verde, with a special interest in the ways that Cabo Verdeans on and off the islands are reconnecting with the Jewish heritage of their nation and of their families. Her current book project is Africa Across the Seder Table, Conversations about Jewish Identity in Cabo Verde and its Diaspora. Professor Gottlieb is the author or co-author of 9 books and dozens of scholarly articles. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow, has awards from the Social Science Research Council, National Endowment for the Humanities, Winter Grin Foundation, and other agencies. And it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Alma Gottlieb.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really delightful to join you, and I'm delighted with the global audience that our platform makes possible. So this book project is long in the making. I began researching the topic back in 2006 in Lisbon. So I had several topics that I thought I would study, all surrounding Cape Verdeans in Lisbon. And the Jewish connection was one, but it was the one that I thought was least likely to succeed because I had read almost nothing about it. I had just read a few footnotes on, page 300 of long books mentioning that there was once a Jewish community and a Jewish diaspora in Cape Verde. It was nothing I knew anything about. I'd never heard of anything to do with Jews in sub-Saharan Africa, and it incited my curiosity. But I had several other topics that I thought I might try out to see which ones people responded to when I started meeting Cape Verdeans in Lisbon. And to my surprise and delight, it was this Jewish connection that really caught people's attention because it had not been studied. And most Cape Verdeans I spoke with in Lisbon were well aware of some kind of Jewish history of their island nation, but few knew anything more about it and were quite curious. So since 2006, I have been pursuing it. And the first slide we should probably show is just a map to put Cape Verdean in your image where the islands are. And they are an archipelago of 9 inhabited islands off the West African coast of Senegal and about 400 miles from the mainland coast of West Africa. And Ron, should I be advancing the slides?
I'm having a problem. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
There we go.
So today in the US, very few people who don't have Cape Verdean heritage themselves have even ever heard of Cape Verde as a country, let alone have any sense of where it is. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, one can say that in some ways Cape Verde served as the center of the world. It was a space from which the Atlantic slave trade was launched. So it's got an ignominious history. Because of its strategic place geologically and in terms of maritime routes and wave and tidal patterns in the Atlantic Ocean, it became the #1 place from which Africans who had been kidnapped from the continent were shipped off to the Americas, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean, and secondarily to what became North America, or what was titled North America. And so during its first 150 years or so, it had an outsized role in the globalization of the world. And the island nation had been unoccupied. There's some controversy about whether it had ever been occupied. Certainly it was known to ancient European and African sailors, and there's some evidence that people had spent brief periods of time, at least on the islands, but at the time that they were rediscovered by Portuguese sailors in the mid-15th century, 1452 to 1456, the islands were not occupied by humans. And in fact, they weren't occupied by many animals either, because it turns out that the soils are not particularly rich or welcoming to any animal life. And so the Portuguese crown, which had sent these sailors to the islands, decided that the islands belonged to them and started occupying them, started sending Portuguese prisoners and political exiles to the island. And just around this time in the late 15th century, as many of you may be well aware, anti-Semitism was ramping up in the Iberian Peninsula, both in Spain, which you might be more familiar with, and in Portugal. And by the turn of the 16th century, anti-Semitism had really taken hold in Southern Europe, and in particular, Spain and Portugal. The Inquisition began first in Spain and then traveled to Portugal. And that spiritual development in the history of the religious constellation of the Iberian Peninsula sent tens of thousands of Jews packing, as I'm sure many of you are well aware. And that diaspora, which has come to be known as the Sephardic diaspora, has many well-known contours. Many Portuguese and Spanish Jews traveled east in Europe and settled in small cities in England, in Italy, in France, farther to the east and north. Probably the largest two concentrations initially were in Amsterdam and in Istanbul. And from there, they tended to circle around the Mediterranean. And that diaspora is fairly well known. Once Columbus opened up sea routes to what he arrogantly called the New World, which of course was not new to the people already inhabiting that world, many Sephardic Jews started hopping on ships crossing the Atlantic and ended up as some of the earliest settlers in what came to be known as the Americas, both in Latin America, many in Brazil, many across the Caribbean, and increasingly many in North America as well. So that is the basic contour of the Sephardic history, with which I'm sure many of you are quite well familiar. But there's one little footnote in that diasporic global history that often gets omitted, and that is the Cape Verdean connection. So because the Portuguese Empire tends to be less in Anglophone readers' minds than the Spanish Empire, and because Cape Verde is a relatively obscure nation today, virtually nothing about Cape Verde history normally gets told. So just to backtrack slightly, I put Cape Verde right in the center here to highlight our attention, but of course for people without specific ancestry or knowledge of Cape Verde, those little dots in the Atlantic, 400 miles west of Dakar, might remain quite invisible. And we can probably go to the next slide. And just again, to resituate ourselves in the world of the Atlantic, the archipelago has been divided by cultural geographers into two subsets, here in Portuguese termed the Ilhas de Barlavento, which is the northern or windward Islands and the Ilhas do Sotavento, the southern or Leeward Islands. And the islands themselves as islands, of course, before air travel was possible, were fairly isolated from one another, and many specific cultural practices and linguistic dialects developed in somewhat isolation from each other on these islands. And anthropologists and sociologists sometimes talk about the islands in these two groups as if they're homogeneous, but in fact, there is plenty of heterogeneity even within the two island groups. So the way historians think about it, we read about two basic large waves of immigration into Cape Verde. The first was from that early period that I mentioned, and then a second later wave beginning in the early 19th century, continuing for about a century until the beginnings of the 20th century, came from Morocco, from Moroccan Jews. And in this image, you can see on the left a tombstone from one Moroccan Jewish immigrant who was buried in Cape Verde. And I'll be talking a little bit about those cemeteries and current project created by an incredible American researcher interested in the topic to restore these tombstones. On the right, just sort of a teaser image from one of the islands where one of the small towns on the island was named Synagoga, although nobody has yet discovered any actual architectural remains for something like what we would call a synagogue, but there was clearly a large active early Jewish presence on that island. So thinking about the two waves of Jews, the first one, as I said, arrived beginning in the late 15th century, continuing through the 17th century from Portugal. And these were largely Jews fleeing anti-Semitism. And we can keep going through the slides quickly here. The first edict of expulsion in Iberia was in 1492, the more famous one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, from King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I, his wife, issuing what came to be known as the Alhambra Decree, expelling that all Jews from Aragon and Castile needed to leave. So that propelled an enormous exodus. It's hard to tell with exact precision how many Spaniards of Jewish descent left Spain at that point, but most historians think at least 10,000, and several think several tens of thousands. And they went in various directions, but a large number actually easily crossed the border into Portugal. And we can go to the next slide. And then 4 years later, horrendously, Portugal's own king, King Manuel, signed a similar decree in 1496. He was pressured by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella themselves of Spain because of complicated political rivalries linking their two nations. And he declared that all Jews needed to leave Portugal within 10 months, but then had something of a change of heart and decided that they couldn't leave, they just had to convert. And so there was a massive effort to force all known Jews to Christianity. Some Jews acquiesced willingly, some acquiesced begrudgingly, some refused to acquiesce. So there's a range of response, and there's been quite a lot of amazing scholarly effort by historians to try and chronicle the range of these responses. And of those who refused to acquiesce, many were killed. The most famous incident occurred in 1506, where at least 1,000, and by some estimates, perhaps as many as 4,000 Jews were killed in the streets in a massive riot, an uprising that was sadly inspired by the preaching of a Dominican friar. a priest in a Catholic church right in the center of Lisbon. Today, there is finally, after over 500 years, a memorial to those who were killed in that massacre, which occurred over the course of several days. And that massacre certainly contributed to motivate many, many more Jews to leave as they saw the dangers facing them. So the exodus continued over the next century and a half or so. In 1531, the Portuguese crown finally declared the Inquisition as a legal entity. It already had been declared as such in Spain, and that further impelled far more Jews to leave. And as I said, Jews left in all sorts of directions, but one of the lesser known directions was the islands of Cape Verde. And so from 1540 to 1794, there were courts in Lisbon, in Porto, in Coimbra, and Évora, four major cities in Portugal, that were conducting legal trials against anyone accused of being Jewish, or as the term was coined then, Judaizing. As something like 1,175 people were burned to death in acts of faith, as they were horrendously misnamed, auto da fe. If you've ever seen that term and wondered what it meant, that's what it means. Another 633 people were burned in effigy, and a far greater number, 29,590 people, these are all according to the latest historical records, they may be updated in the future, were forced to what was called do penance for what was considered their sins of heresy, and forced to convert to Christianity. So in the context of this kind of persistent oppression occurring over the course of several centuries, Jews were continually leaving. And some of them had already fully renounced their Jewish practice, but were nevertheless being persecuted because it was either suspected or known that they had ancestors who were Jewish. Some of them were continuing to practice in secret, usually up in the mountains to the north of Portugal. And those who were accused sometimes were accused, we might say, with reason in a perverse sense, because they were still actively practicing, but many of them were not. Many of them had long given up Jewish practice and had become practicing Catholics. So there was a range of experience. And as I said, tens of thousands of Jews fled Portugal, creating the Sephardic migration. All these little red dots around the map of Europe and North Africa indicate points that I'm sure many of you are familiar with what became a global Sephardic migration. And we can move. And then the second wave occurred later in somewhat related but distinct circumstances, starting briefly in the early 19th century, picking up steam in the mid to late 19th century, and continuing until the early years of the 20th century. And my historian colleague, Angela Benolil-Coutinho, is now chronicling spectacularly this particular later migration stream. And there were many historical, political, and economic reasons for this later exodus from Morocco of Jews to Cape Verde. It was a time of tremendous internal political instability within Morocco, partly because of pressures from Europe, and as is often the case, as is known, I'm sure, to many in this audience, Jews were often scapegoated for these internal pressures, which were also causing a great deal of economic instability. So large numbers of Jews started leaving in the early to mid years and picking up steam in the later years of the 19th century. Again, paralleling the earlier global migration. They went many places. Many went north to Europe, especially to France and elsewhere. And again, a tinier, much less known number decided to go to Cape Verde. Perhaps some of them may have been aware of the fact that there had been this earlier set of Jews fleeing the Iberian Inquisition. And again, my colleague Angela Coutinho is documenting those links in that history. And from Morocco, the four major, what we might call sending cities were Tangier, Tetuan, Rabat, and what was then called Mogador, now called Essaouira. These are all, as you can see from the map, coastal cities. Most, not all, but most of Morocco's Jews had been living in coastal cities, these and some other smaller ones. And some of them had been involved in trade, which coastal location would have propelled. And we can go to the next. A smaller number of Moroccan Jews first, when they left Morocco, found their way to Gibraltar for complicated geopolitical reasons that I won't go into now. And most of them stayed or went elsewhere. But again, a tiny number of them left Gibraltar and decided to emigrate to Cape Verde. So these are complicated, multi-leveled tiers of migration streams. It's not a one-size-fits-all or a simple migration story. There are multiple stories, and some of the descendants of some of these families are quite well aware of their families' histories, some less so. As the years pass, some memories are fading. And these are the names of some of the major families that do have their origins in this 19th century Moroccan migration. Many of these names are quite well known in Cape Verde. Not all, but many Cape Verdeans who are not part of these families may be aware that these families have Moroccan and or Jewish ancestry, but not all are. And as the years fade, perhaps memories fade as well. Over here is a photo of one of the members of one of these families, João Benolil de Carvalho, who is the inheritor of a family business simply called right now JBC, importing various construction materials and so forth. So when I first started this research, I, as an anthropologist, was primarily interested in the stories of the living. That's who I'm trained to talk to, and I enjoy talking to living people who can talk. Bones and archives can't talk directly, only indirectly, and I don't enjoy hanging out with bones or archives as much as some of my scholars do, and thank goodness they do. But I did learn, as I mentioned, that the historical narrative is absolutely critical to understanding both where these people came from and also understanding their own subjectivity and their own understanding of their histories. So I have gotten to know many hundreds of Cape Verdeans who have one version or another of some of this ancestry. In general, the more recent their Jewish ancestry, the more they know about it. So the people who know the most are those who had living grandparents or great-grandparents who themselves had emigrated or had heard stories of their parents who had emigrated. There are fewer and fewer of these people. They're quite elderly right now, and their memories are sometimes living within them, sometimes passing along to next generations, but not always, as family stories go. Some remain active and some fade. So in recent years, especially those who have Moroccan ancestry have become increasingly motivated to learn more about that Moroccan and Jewish ancestry for many reasons, one of which is the internet. And Cape Verdeans tend to have a higher level of formal westernized education than people in many other sub-Saharan African countries for a variety of reasons, but they have one of the very highest literacy rates of sub-Saharan African countries. And more Cape Verdeans have active access to the internet. And in the diaspora, that access, of course, increases with greater technological access. And so they're finding out on their own more about their own ancestry. Those who think that they might have Jewish ancestry from the earlier waves from 300, 400, 500 years ago have a much harder time of discovering their ancestry. They need to really almost become professional historians, genealogists, archivists, etc., because those histories are much more submerged. But some of them are doing that and finding it intriguing, compelling, rewarding, and whether or not they can absolutely, with full certainty, chronicle and document their Jewish ancestry, a small number of these folks are finding their ways to becoming practicing Jews. Here's one image of somebody who does have Moroccan Jewish ancestry that is quite well known. And this is a photo I took of him in a context that I'll talk about later in Praia, where he was looking at the tombstones of some Moroccan Jews, not his direct ancestors, but others from that general cohort. And in a ceremony to rededicate the cemetery, which I'll talk about in a moment, he donned a yarmulke for the first time in his life. And he was sort of trying it on, imagining what it would have felt like if he had been raised in a community of practicing Jews. And when I asked him about how he felt about it, he was very thoughtful. He said it feels okay. It hadn't occurred to him to try it on before, but he was surrounded by some small group of practicing Jews, including a rabbi who was conducting the ceremony. And he said it felt right to him to try on that yarmulke. To the left and right are some images I've snapped of some Cape Verdeans' living rooms and the ways in which they are putting various sort of Jewish imagery and paraphernalia out front in the public eye where guests would see them, to chronicle their developing interest in Jewish history and some version of their Jewish ancestry and in some ways Jewish identity. Couple of images of three of the folks in New England who I've been getting to know in recent years, who've all made significant steps to becoming practicing Jews and defining themselves as Jewish, redefining their identities. None of these people was born into a Jewish household. The two, well, the one on the top left knew early on that he had Moroccan Jewish ancestry. The person on the bottom and the top right did not grow up with the knowledge that they had Jewish ancestry, but later on in life, as they were starting to explore their history, came to the understanding that they do have that ancestry. And all three of these men are members of temples. The one in the left is an occasional temple goer. The one on the right is a very active temple goer in a conservative temple in New England. And the one on the bottom middle is a very active member of an Orthodox temple and has actually become one of the major leaders in his temple. So these three represent one end of the spectrum of engagement. By no means have most Cape Verdeans become that active. So this is a project that has been going on for a little over a decade now. I wanted to show a beautiful brochure that the director of this program produced a few years ago. So the project is called the Cape Verde Jewish Heritage Project, CVJHP. And its mission, it says, is to honor and preserve Cape Verde Sephardic heritage by restoring and maintaining Jewish burial grounds, documenting the contributions of Moroccan Jews and their descendants to Cape Verde and nearby regions, and educating future generations about the Jews of Cape Verde. And this originally began as a one-person project. Started by an extraordinary woman named Carol Castile, who had been involved with education projects in the US, promoting scholarships for students of color, and happened to come across a bunch of Cape Verdeans in her former job who had names like Livy and Cohn. And as a Jew herself, her curiosity was incited, and she began discovering, in particular, the Moroccan Jewish history of Cape Verde, became intrigued, discovered the sad state of some Moroccan Jewish tombstones on some of the islands, and inaugurated a nonprofit organization to raise funds and restore the cemeteries. And this image shows a pretty dramatic before and after pair of photos from one of the islands, the island of Santiago, which is the island that houses the modern nation's capital city of Praia. And this is a tiny section in a very large urban cemetery in downtown Praia, the capital. And these few tombstones had become neglected over the years. You could see they'd sunk into the ground. They were not being kept up, and there was no signage, so one could easily pass by them without really taking notice. And Carol Castile has managed to raise a significant amount of funds from various sources. And this was the first major project that was drawn to completion back in 2013. She managed to entice a chief rabbi from Europe to come and do a ritual rededication of the cemetery after the physical restoration was completed. You can see here two family members in that cemetery sharing a single grave. So the ritual rededication of these graves attracted a small but really fervent group of Cape Verdeans, some who were already still living on the islands, and some others who had flown in from afar, from Europe and the US. And it was, in some ways, a kind of a loose family reunion. There were some people who did meet each other and discover that they were actually related in genealogically known ways. But beyond that, there was a general sense that this was a group of people who had refound each other and refound an aspect of their identity that had been either submerged or lonely. And they have managed to recreate a certain sense of community among themselves. And once this cemetery was completed, the organization that Carol Castile founded has managed to complete restoration of some other cemeteries on some other islands, and these projects are ongoing. We now know of Jewish burials on several other islands. It may be that in the end, Jewish burials are found on all of the islands, or maybe not, we don't yet know, but this is still an ongoing project. And as that project has progressed and focused in particular on the more recent Moroccan wave, because it's far easier to document that wave, that project has expanded its mandate and is now supporting research into the history of the Moroccan migration with, as I mentioned, Angela Coutinho completing, I think, what may soon be a published book on that topic. These are the two big projects. Each of them occupies a chapter in my book that I'm completing now. These are the two big sort of community projects coming out of this set of individual rediscovery of Jewish ancestry. The one I just talked about is focused in Cape Verde. This one is focused in the US with the New England-based diaspora of Cape Verdeans. After Cape Verde gained its independence in 1975, there was a large out-migration from the islands. There had been many waves of outmigration from the islands for the past couple hundred years. But the more recent one in 1975 was sparked by a particular political development of independence. And before then, most emigration had either gone to Portugal, well, most had gone to Portugal. A smaller number had gone to the US with the whaling trade starting in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, as Cape Verdean men, young men in particular, were recruited as sailors on the New England whaling ships. And as the whaling trade declined for various ecological and economic reasons, and also technological reasons, that migration stream slowed. Other migration streams picked up for various reasons through the course of the 20th century, but it's been in the past probably 50 years or so that a new wave of migration to the US has been happening. And certainly it was motivated by that earlier New England stream of whaling migration. So in the modern era, many more Cape Verdeans have been migrating to the US, and specifically to New England, which was the seat of the whaling trade. In and around Boston, southeastern New England is the epicenter. New Bedford and Boston were the epicenters of the whaling trade. Rhode Island has also been an active destination for much of this migration, which is why I find myself living in Rhode Island right now. And so a group of Jews and Cape Verdeans for the past 17 years have been organizing an annual Seder as a way to connect the two communities, specifically in Boston. So until the pandemic, this was an in-person event uniting mostly Jews and Cape Verdeans who were living in and around the Boston area. With the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic in 2020, there was no event because the world was in crisis. Nobody knew what to do about anything at that point. But the next year, 2021, there was a completely virtual Seder held online, which allowed a whole new approach to the Seder. Last year, there was a mostly hybrid version, a mostly virtual version, but it was hybrid. There was a tiny group having tentatively a mini Seder in Boston and another tiny group having a mini Seder in Cape Verde. And this year it will again be hybrid, but with the proportion changing. It will mostly be in person in Boston with a little group in person in Praia, but it will also be live streamed. So over the past 17 years, the model has been changing and expanding. The first year it was a small event, I think maybe 50 or 60 people, and it's now grown to about 200 people every year. Probably we can go through another couple slides. So this is one image from pre-pandemic when it was a large event of 200 people. And by design, the idea is to get about half Cape Verdeans and half Jews. And every year, more and more people are identifying in both categories. And each table, which seats 10 people, is intended to seat ideally 5 Cape Verdeans and 5 Jews. But as I said, increasingly, some people are identifying as both. And in the next slide, we can see a check-in table here. Those little colored sticker dots are all handed out as people register. This was in the pre-pandemic times for the large event of 200. And they receive, in the old days, they would receive one color dot if they identified as Jewish and a different color dot if they identified as Cape Verdean. Now, with more and more people identifying as both Jewish and Cape Verdean, there's a third color dot to indicate those who identify as both. And the people at this check-in table will distribute these dots to make sure that each table has roughly an equivalent amount of Cape Verdeans, Jews, and Cape Verdean Jews. And the idea there is to get a conversation going literally around the Seder table. These Seders always have music. Music is absolutely critical to the Cape Verdean experience. There's virtually no social event with Cape Verdeans that doesn't have music. And to counterbalance that, there's been an effort also to have some version of Jewish music sung. And so typically there'll either be one Cape Verdean musician or band playing, and then one Jewish group of either singers or musicians playing music. Increasingly, the musicians have been inspired by each other and are starting to play together, which has been a really beautiful development. This particular slide shows a group of Yiddish singers in Boston who practice as a Yiddish singing chorus. One year, a couple of years ago, they did that. And of course, no Cape Verdean or Jewish event, or for that matter, probably most human events, is complete without food. And those of you who are familiar with the traditional Ashkenazi menu for a Seder might be surprised to see some of these items on the menu. But until the pandemic, there was a complete served meal with dishes that spoke both to the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic culinary practices, as well as traditional Cape Verdean culinary practices. This is one example of a menu, but there's always a double menu, one in English, one in Portuguese, one showing dishes from various Jewish culinary practices, and one showing dishes from Cape Verdean practices. And then for those of you familiar with the text, the Haggadah, which is the traditional text read in some version or another at a traditional Jewish Seder, has been totally revamped. And the Haggadah text some years ago had a group of Cape Verdeans and Jews to totally deconstruct the classic Haggadah text and rewrite it in ways that would speak to shared experiences across Jewish and Cape Verdean diasporic histories. And the Haggadah now is written trilingually. Everything is in English. Portions are in Hebrew and portions are in the first language spoken by Cape Verdeans, which is a language called Criollo, or simply Cape Verdean, the Cape Verdean language. And in lieu of one Passover leader, which is traditionally in patriarchal versions of Judaism, the oldest man in the family. In lieu of that, there are always two leaders. They may or may not be old or male or female, but there's always two, and one is always Jewish and the other is always Cape Verdean. And again, the Cape Verdean sometimes already knows that he or she has Jewish ancestry, but often not. And in some cases, the Cape Verdean leader is going to a Passover Seder for the first time and learning everything from scratch. And that's always an interesting process to document. Again, for those who are familiar with traditional Passover Seders, at the heart of the text is this set of 4 questions, and the 4 questions are quite formulaic over and over again. They're the same questions asked in Hebrew, English, Hebrew, or whatever language you're participating in. This is what the Haggadah last looked like. Before the pandemic, there was always a printed Haggadah. This is what it last looked like back in 2019. And it's a pretty, well, it's not as long as some Haggadahs, but this one is 26 pages. And there is a section called the 4 questions. And on this page, there is an English and Hebrew version of the classic 4 questions as they're normally posed at Passover Seders. And on this page, there's a reinterpreted version called the 4 questions for today. There we go. And this second question, traditionally referring to the bitterness of the herbs. On all other days, we might eat any herbs. Why today are we only eating bitter herbs? And the answer that the combined group of Cape Verdeans and Jews came up with some years ago when they rewrote this was, tonight we eat bitter herbs to remind us of the slavery and oppression experienced by our ancestors in Egypt, something certainly familiar to all Jews attending Passover Seders anywhere. Today, that oppression exists in all forms of the fighting, senseless youth homicides, international conflicts, and genocide. The bitterness of the herbs reminds us of our shared pain and our duty to bring peace to those currently being oppressed. And so this answer, like other answers to other questions, is specifically meant to speak to shared histories of oppression and tragically shared current experiences of oppression as well. And the idea here is to highlight both the shared interlinked history of Cape Verdeans who have Jewish ancestry, and also to point out to those Cape Verdeans who either know that they don't have Jewish ancestry or have no idea whether or not they did, that with or without such actual links, there are shared parallels in the histories of the 2 groups. Of course, there are plenty of distinguishing facts that differentiate the groups as well. But to the surprise of many, there are also lots of striking parallels. Maybe we can zip through the rest of the slides briefly. Another place that's updated in the traditional Haggadah would be adding not just Miriam's Cup, which is a recent feminist addition to some feminist-oriented seders done maybe in the past 15 or 20 years or so, but adding also to Elijah's Cup, which is the traditional cup at Jewish seders, a cup dedicated to Amilcar Cabral, who was the renowned, extraordinary freedom fighter, brilliant thinker, writer, and strategist who helped organize, had a really galvanizing effect, both militarily, strategically, and also even poetically. He was kind of a Leonardo of his time, many, many skills, and really organized the guerrilla war against the colonial country of Portugal. Sadly, he was assassinated shortly before independence was won, but he remains a martyr and a major figure who's adored by Cape Verdeans the world over. So those who were reinventing this Seder thought it would be appropriate to include a cup in his honor, along with the cup in honor of Miriam. I think we can zip through the next slides quickly. Just an invitation, if any of you Cape Verdean or Jewish or both has been bitten by some curiosity to imagine or experience what this extraordinary event is like. This year, there will be another one. It will be, as I mentioned, hybrid. And for those of you who might be living in it or near Boston, you would certainly be invited to participate in the in-person event. It's not going to be 200 people this year. I think there's still some caution about restricting it. I'm not sure how many will be admitted this year, but it won't be 200. And it will also be live streamed, so there'll be ways to participate on Zoom or Facebook. And for any Cape Verdeans listening who might find themselves in Praia, there will be a small Praia event as well. The website is currently being updated, so the best way to find out about the event would be to send an email to the address on screen, Cape Verdean Jewish Seder @gmail.com. And
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you for this interesting set of information. And let's go to the Q&A now. And there was one question about how many communities in Cape Verde actually celebrate the Passover. And I think you mentioned that, but
Well, no, I didn't really, and I actually should have. So 0. At the moment, it's 0. So in a longer version of this talk, if I were to speak more about history, what I would have said was there has really been no practicing Jewish community in living memory, in recent memory. We don't know the extent to which any original emigrants fleeing the Inquisition in Spain or Portugal, landing in Cape Verde, might have been practicing Jews. There are hints that there were. It may be that there were no actual synagogues. In fact, it's likely that there was nothing publicly labeled as a synagogue, but you may be, some of you, aware that Jews don't require a synagogue to practice. In extreme circumstances, such as living in the shadow of an Inquisition, Jews can form a minyan anywhere. It can be inside a living room. It can be, as it was for hundreds of years in the north of Portugal and in parts of New Mexico, in the basement, where no spying eyes through windows would perceive what's going on illegally. It could be outside on a beach, which happened a lot during the pandemic. So we don't really know, because we don't have physical active traces of early 15th, 16th, 17th century Jewish practices. It's likely that there were some in the earliest generations, but the Inquisition cast a long shadow. And the Inquisition from Portugal sent courts around the world to try Jews who were living in lands that had been claimed by the Portuguese crown. And there were Inquisition courts as far as Lima, Peru, in Colombia, and in Goa in India. There were no actual Inquisition courts sent to Cape Verde, probably because it was an outpost with a small population, but there were spies sent by the Inquisition to Cape Verde. And those spies did turn in the 15th and 16th centuries, Cape Verdeans who were accused of being active Jews. We don't know to what extent those accusations were founded or unfounded, but it certainly had a chilling effect. And those who were accused were sent back to Lisbon to be tried by the Inquisition courts in Lisbon. So very early on, it became clear that what had been imagined as a space of religious freedom, where Jews could freely practice and openly practice their forbidden religion from Portugal, was anything but that. And so once again, the religion went underground, and some practices remained in kind of invisible ways, sometimes invisible to their practitioners who didn't have an active memory that these practices had earlier Jewish antecedents. the possibility of an actively practicing Jewish congregation was nil in those circumstances. Today, the Cape Verdean government is very interested in reviving, in creating some kind of Jewish tourist path for Jews interested in the global diaspora to discover this unexpected outpost of Jewish history. And right before the pandemic, a minister of the Cape Verdean government had contacted the organizer of the Seder in Boston that I've just described and asked if there could be some kind of partnership so that a version of that Seder could be re-imported back to Cape Verde as an active, large communal community event. And those conversations were just starting to happen when the pandemic hit. And I think they're just beginning to be reprised now. So we'll see where those conversations go.
There is a question about the language of Cape Verdean that the Jews who went to Cape Verde would have spoken. And the question is whether there was any Yiddish in it, but I think you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, Yiddish is a Creole that combines essentially Hebrew and German. So Yiddish would have been a Creole created by Jews finding themselves living in Germanic speaking countries. The Creole created by Jews in Iberia has been called different names by scholars. Ladino might be the one that you would most likely have heard of. Judeo-Spanish is another. And it's unclear exactly what language Portuguese Jews spoke. That was the Spanish version of a Creole that was a combination of Hebrew and Spanish. There's been less research in general on Portugal than Spain. It's a tiny country and it's much less known. Less research on Portuguese Jews than Spanish Jews, less research done on Portuguese Jewish language than on Spanish Jewish language. There are some hints by some linguists who are starting to look at early Portuguese Jewish language. I'm not familiar with any large comprehensive definitive studies, but there are interesting hints that there may have been some version of a Portuguese Hebrew-based Creole perpetuated by them, but it's not well studied yet. But the language spoken by Cape Verdeans today is another Creole that is sometimes called simply Criollo or Cape Verdean Criollo, or increasingly the Cape Verdean language. And that is a Creole combining Portuguese with largely Portuguese vocabulary, probably 85 to 90% of the vocabulary is from Portuguese, with some syntactical features of some languages spoken by the Africans who were kidnapped from the African countries that was the source of the first Atlantic slave trade. So some features of those languages have entered the Cape Verdean language as well.
We have another question about with the wave of the Moroccan Jews, were they able to connect in any kind of way with the original Portuguese Jews who had been there? Or
yeah, I can't. It's a great question. I can't answer it yet, but I think my colleague Angela Coutinho is working on that, and we will eagerly await her book. I believe that is one of the questions that she is pursuing.
And there is a question about the Jewish practices that might have been, and you've mentioned about lighting candles and other things.
Yeah, so
might connect.
Right. And this is something that for those of you tuning in from New Mexico might be surprisingly familiar. But there's now a well-documented set of particular kinds of Jewish practices that survived the Inquisition in the Sephardic diaspora. And wherever you go, you will often find these traces, remnants, ghostly hauntings. We have different ways we could talk about them, of practices that either probably or definitely had Jewish ancestry. I say probably or definitely, depending on whether the person has known or likely ancestry. But several of those that I've documented extensively among Cape Verdeans with Jewish ancestry are lighting candles Friday night. And I have many, many narratives that I've collected from Cape Verdeans who tell me, in my household, we always lit a candle on Friday night. Usually it was my grandmother. We never knew why. We always thought it was weird. Nobody else we knew did it, but we were never allowed to ask questions. So we had no idea. And often it's Cape Verdeans in the US who start getting invited to the homes of observant Jews as friends or colleagues or neighbors, and discover that, oh, that's a Jewish thing. Oh, wait, where did that come from? Maybe I should go back and ask my grandmother, right? Oh, my grandmother says we had Jewish ancestry. I had no idea, right? So in many of these family narratives that I'm collecting, the oldest relatives have knowledge that there was Jewish ancestry, and they have suppressed it in terms of discourse. They're not teaching their children or grandchildren about it. We might say that the shadow of the Inquisition is still long. There is still fear. Of course, the Inquisition was ended 200 years ago, 1821 in Portugal, a little later in Spain. But these kinds of traumatizing institutions outlive their active practice.
Also, can you discuss the term cashew?
Oh, yes. Okay. So that is a really charming, creative neologism created by one Cape Verdean with known Jewish ancestry. She's one of the Cape Verdeans I know who has really professional level expertise in researching her and others' genealogies, and has traced Jewish ancestry in her family back through extensive archival research. So she now acknowledges that she has Jewish ancestry. She was raised as a Catholic. She would like to incorporate some understanding of her Jewish ancestry into her life, although she does not have an interest in living as a practicing Jew. But she now calls herself, when she's asked to identify her religion, let's say on a census form or something like that, she now calls herself a cashew. And she spells it the way we would spell cashew in English, C-A-S-H-E-W, referring to the cashew nut. But it's become for her a bilingual pun with a lot of interesting historical resonance, because she discovered in Cape Verde, where cashew trees do grow and where they are called caju, and that's spelled C-A-J-U in Portuguese, caju, that cashews are not classified as a nut in Cape Verde or Portugal, for that matter, but rather as a fruit. And growing up as a Cape Verdean American in the US, she'd always been raised to think of cashews as a nut. And in thinking about the conceptual shift required to recategorize a food item like a cashew into one food group rather than another, a fruit rather than a nut, it made her think about the ways in which she was metaphorically recategorizing herself as not a Jew, but no longer a full Catholic, but something in between, some kind of hybrid. And so she's adopted that term, cashew in English, caju in Portuguese, as a way to sort of playfully recategorize her hybridized identity. I didn't fully answer that other question about other lingering practices from Judaism. I mentioned candlelighting, but there are plenty of others. Another one that has really struck me has been pork avoidance. And that's especially striking because pork happens to be maybe the most popularly eaten food in Portuguese cuisine. It is very hard to avoid some version of pork products in any Portuguese restaurant or meal. And that includes not just main dishes and vegetable side dishes, which might be cooked with lard, but soups. I once ordered a soup in a Portuguese restaurant and asked if it was vegetarian rather than asking if it had pork. And the waiter said, yes, it is vegetarian. There's only tiny bits of ham in it. So that's a classic way of thinking about pork as being an unmarked category. It's invisible. It's just present. You don't really need to comment on it. Lard is a very common ingredient in desserts, so it's actually difficult to avoid pork in any course in Portuguese cuisine. So the fact that many, many Cape Verdeans whom I've spoken with, some of whom know they have Jewish ancestry, some of whom don't, tell me that they avoid pork is really striking, because that does not happen much in Portugal. And they have a variety of reasons to explain it. Some of them who know they have Jewish ancestry will tell me that they were taught by their parents that they should never eat pork, or their grandparents in some cases. In other cases, they have lots of culinary and stomach digestive reasons, but it is disproportionate how many people avoid pork. Lots of other practices as well. There's a version of a traditional Cape Verdean funeral that really resembles the classic Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva that may or may not have Jewish ancestry. I haven't yet fully unpacked that, but it's certainly striking that there are a lot of parallels and other practices as well. But we should probably look at some other questions.
And we have many questions.
Okay.
If you have time to look at more things.
Sure, and I'll try and answer more pithily too.
There is a question about were the Portuguese conversos in that first wave. Do you have any indication if they were involved in the slave trade?
Yes, some were and some were not. And that is a painful subject for Jews to acknowledge. It's also been the source of disturbing instances of anti-Semitism. It's been one of the causes for ruptures in what had been, in an earlier portion of US history, more productive relationships between African Americans and Jews, when a certain group of African Americans started blaming Jews entirely for the slave trade. So that is not the case. The largest proportion of slave traders were not Jews. Nevertheless, there definitely were Jewish slave traders. And as I mentioned, the Cape Verdean Islands were strategically situated between Europe to the north, West Africa to the east, and the Americas to the west. Favorable trade winds and tidal patterns also situated them well for this newly developing global trade uniting 3 continents. And many of the earliest Jewish converso migrants, as well as many of the later Moroccan migrants as well, were traders. Of those, probably a small proportion were slave traders. Probably the largest proportion were traders in other goods, not humans. But they cannot be fully absolved from the slave trade. The other items that they were trading included a kind of plant that was used to produce an indigo dye. That was a big product in the early days. Also animal hides, goat skins, horns, some foodstuffs, several other items as well. Yeah.
There is a question if the lecture will be repeated, and so what I might mention is the recording of the lecture will be posted on the Jewish Learning channel, and for everyone who has registered, we will be sending out the notice as soon as that's available.
Thank you.
And let's see, Rick Vitale has a number of Cape Verdean friends in the province area, and he would like to know how to communicate with you. he can probably find you through Brown University, I suspect.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to be in touch with anybody who'd like to be. My Brown email is easy. It's just my full name, Alma, and then an underscore Gottlieb at brown.edu. So absolutely, please do be in touch. I did just see one quick question that I can answer very quickly in the chat. Is the joint dinner in Boston kosher? And the answer is yes, it is. Although this year, I'm not sure how much of a dinner it will be, but it has always been kosher in the past.
And Carol Castiel puts in a note, which I can get part of it. It mentions that having started research before the 501c3 was created in 2008. There was the book project was expansion of the goals to produce publications, and the Cape Verdean Jewish History Project hired a person to do archival research in Morocco and the Gibraltar Jews of Cape Verde. So there it goes on mentioning the research that has been done and documentation there, and that there will be a forthcoming book in Portuguese on the subject.
Yeah, that's great that Carol has joined us and has added in those details. Thank you, Carol, for doing so. And I should mention that the date of the Seder, for anybody who might be interested, is March 26th this year. It typically occurs a week or so before the official Seder to allow those who are practicing Jews and would like extra time to prepare for the Seder to do so. And the originator of the Seder is an American Jewish man named Joel Schwartz, who may be on the talk today. And if he is, if he wants to add anything to what I've said briefly, this would be a great time to do so, since I do see there is some interest in that event.
And okay, there is one mention here. Someone said they noticed in the Passover menu that on the Cape Verde side, there seemed to be a meat and a milk products.
Interesting. I don't recall that. That's possible. Normally, when I've taken notice of it, I believe that the meal has been kosher. There is, but maybe there was one year where that escaped. There is one famous Cape Verdean dish that Cape Verdeans around the world often take as a symbol of their Cape Verdean identity, the way maybe some, at least Ashkenazi Jews, may see, for example, chicken soup as a symbol of their Ashkenazi identity. And that is a dish called kachupa. And for Cape Verdeans of limited financial means, it may be vegetarian. For those who have a bit more money, a sign of their prosperity will be to eat meat. And the commonest meats are pork-based, various kinds of ham, sausage, and so forth. But there is a smaller subgroup of Cape Verdeans who will not put pork in their kachupa, but do want to put some kind of animal protein in. I interviewed one Cape Verdean man who happens to be a chef in a Cape Verdean restaurant in Paris, who told me that he only makes his kachupa with tuna. And he was taught to do so by his grandmother, who he knew did have Jewish ancestry. So at all of the Seder meals that I recall being involved in or knowing about, there was always discussion that any Cape Verdeans who wanted to be contributing kachupa to this meal needed to make sure that it was either vegetarian or had fish, but no pork. But if there was one dish that included meat and milk, I think that must have escaped. Thank you for pointing that out.
Roger de Freitas says, thank you for the lecture and for the opportunity to listen to it again. And I think all of us give you that thanks. Thank you for being here, and thank you for talking about this extraordinary experience.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you. I've enjoyed listening to the questions, I had a chance to, and I apologize if there was anybody else who had another question that I didn't get to, but again, I'd be happy to be in touch with anybody who'd like to communicate.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everybody.
And thank all of you who have been here this evening as a part of this program. And we will be announcing the future programs from the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. And thank you for being with us tonight. And Professor Gottlieb, it's been a special pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.